So this week, chapter 5, is titled the Gender of Sexuality. So that's, you can tell, it's going to be quite an interesting, probably somewhat controversial chapter of the information, but it's kind of fascinating, really, when you dig down, deeply into it from a sociological perspective, and not so much from a biological perspective. So what we're going to do in this chapter is think about how sex, love, and attraction are related to each other. And as we go through the chapter, it's important to acknowledge, I think, that it's difficult to have a conversation about gender without also talking about sexuality. They go together. So the subject of sex is extremely complicated. It's not as simple as many people make it out to be. And for one reason that it's complicated is that the very definitions of sex and sexuality uh, differs from one person to another, and certainly from one culture to another. And then that's those two words, sex and sexuality, don't even include romantic love and emotional intimacy, which are a whole nother aspect. So let's look at some of the definitions of those things. So romantic love involves coming together, sharing, and feeling united with one another in a way that the object of love is considered irreplaceable. And I have to add here that irreplaceability, that feeling of that person being irreplaceable, in many cases is as long as, that's at least as long as the feeling of that way lasts. The people that we feel romantic about and emotional about and think we can't live without and they're irreplaceable, that may be a passing feeling eventually. And on the other hand, it may not be. It may someone you remember when you're very, very old, that was the one person that you really, really felt romantically about. And so that idea of romantic love began with the troubadours in the Middle Ages, and they were in love with a particular lady. This is all in courts, so it was very upper class. It was the nobility, and they would sing love songs to the lady, and that type of thing. But they could never consummate the relationship. She was usually married to the lord of the manor. So there's a film called Strange Relations that when we get to the section on marriage, I'll put that film up for you, that starts with explaining what romantic love is and how it developed, the history of it. It's quite interesting. So that's romantic love. So emotional intimacy involves the sharing of oneself with another, and thereby creating a mutual understanding with that person. Being intimate with them is we're talking about emotional intimacy here, the definition, not sexual intimacy. So often when we talk about sexuality, what we're really discussing are what are called sexual identities. Sexual identities is the particular category into which people place themselves on the current division into heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, demisexual, and asexual. And I'm sure there'll be more, forms of sexuality added to this as, we move through new time periods. So your sexual identity is how you label your own sexuality. And so then the last term to define here in this discussion is sexual attraction. And that's, who are you attracted to? And it's probably the most difficult one to define, as you might imagine. Freud called it the love object. And how do you measure that? Is it measured biologically? Is it measured emotionally? So your text's author defines sexual attraction as a combination of objective physical responses, so that's objective physical responses, and subjective psychological or emotional responses. And sexual desire definitely has a physical component. But as you're going to find out here, and know, having read the chapter, it can also be deeply influenced by culture. And culture is, after all, what teaches us when, where, and with whom it's appropriate to feel sexual attraction. When we get farther into this and start talking about the experiences of young women who are still adolescents, the difference between Dutch parents and American parents around the sexual behavior of their older teen daughters is totally different. And so are the girls' experiences, of course, because of that. And that's cultural, based on whether you're in an American culture or a Dutch culture. We'll get into that deeper as we move forward. So here's the question. Next section is, does sexuality have a gender? So as you read about in this chapter, John Stoltenberg wrote a kind of a imaginary fantasy of what a culture would be like, of imagining a world without sex categories or gender. Um, Other authors have also written things about that as well, kind of fantasy or sci-fi stuff. So in his world, Stoltenberg's world, the uniqueness of each person is emphasized, but there's no announcement of a baby, of whether it's a boy or a girl, or identifying someone that way. It's the unique personality, personhood of each person that's emphasized. And so by not identifying, so there's no category that's assigned to each person in this world, that where people are presumed to be alike. In this discussion, males are presumed to be alike in one way and females in another. That's not how this culture works, this imaginary culture. It's based on who you are as an individual. So instead, any newborn with sexual anomalies, those that we've talked about previously, chromosomal or physical, so any babies that are born with those kinds of, quote, differences are celebrated, and instead of, manipulated and changed or go through the experiences that we read about in a previous chapter. They're celebrated as an example of how unique every individual is. So in Stoltenberg's imaginary world, there are therefore no sex categories. There are just people who are different from others in a variety of ways. And what he's demonstrating, Stoltenberg, in writing this, fantasy fiction thing, is he's demonstrating in his imaginary world that our erotic lives are not out acting their status in any particular category. Well, what that means is that sex, for i.e., sex is not how they create the idea of gender in this imaginary world. So the point of the description, and what he is describing, is also true for this world. But the difference is how we make sense of those biological realities that are not necessarily strictly female and strictly male. So various gender scholars point out that we create the idea of gender partly through our expectations about what it means to be a woman or a man. And we talked about that with children previously, in the last chapter, in the previous chapter. So we have expectations, which our culture tells us, and our family of origin and all our very important others out there in the world, and then from that we develop our ideas. And that leads us to these two concepts that are very, very important: heteronormativity and compulsive heterosexuality. So hetero is different, right? That refers to male and female. Normativity is normal, from the word normal. And compulsive heterosexuality, you know what compulsive means. It means you have to do it. You have to be You don't literally, but the idea with compulsive heterosexuality is that everybody should be heterosexual, right? That's the default setting. So the definition of heteronormativity is the way in which heterosexuality is viewed as the normal, natural way of being. If you go back to look at that heterosexual questionnaire on page 125, you'll see it's very, very interesting because the first question is, what do you think caused your heterosexuality? Okay, nobody ever asks you that. They ask people, what do you think caused your homosexuality? But this is where the heteronormativity comes in. Nobody even asks you why you think you're heterosexual. So some of these examples of heteronormativity are children who are bullied for being, quote, gay. And they're often being teased, not, they're children after all, not for their sexual expression, their same-sex sexual expressions or desires, but what they're being teased about is for their what's called gender nonconformity, and we talked about that as well. So being gender nonconformant for a little boy, they wind up being called sissy and fag if they read certain books, if they're nice, if they don't like pornography when they're a bit older, if they like certain kinds of music, or walk a certain way, or talk a certain way. So does this list necessarily reflect who those boys, the older ones that are teased this way, want to have sex with? Or is it more accurately just about his gender performance, which we have talked a lot about, how he presents himself to the world, which is non-conforming. The way he presents himself to the world is non-conforming. So but in Anglo-European society, the answer is yes. This gender performance does, by default, imply heterosexuality if he isn't heteronormative in his masculine behavior. So because in our society there's a clear link between gender and heterosexuality, that it's taken for granted. And that is an example of heteronormativity, this division into two lines of behavior with sexuality is what assumed to be heteronormativity. That's the normal way. Okay. Now, compulsive heterosexuality is the way in which it's institutionalized. Okay, it's the way heteronormativity is institutionalized and either rewarded or punished in many ways as well. And it's enforced in our daily lives. And it becomes a way of regulating behaviors and distributing power and privilege, which is a key point. Because remember, sociology of gender is always also exploring the ideas of power and privilege. Who benefits from these ideas, right? Who is privileged by these ideas? So this perspective is from an essay by Adrienne Rich, in which she explains the way that heterosexuality is, as an institution, serves to ensure male, physical, emotional, and economic access to women. Let's say that. So that heterosexuality as an institution privileges males in their physical, emotional, and economic access to women. And Rich also identified the important role of sexuality in reinforcing gender inequality, right? So cis heteropatriarchy explains the connections between gender identity, gender inequality, and the ways in which a gender binary system presumes heterosexuality as a social norm. And these concepts are one of the very most important points in understanding the connections between these three categories: sex category, gender, and sexuality, all of which we have defined in previous chapters. So, and as we've discussed in those previous chapters, sexuality is very deeply gendered. So because of that, Heterosexuality as an institution has very different effects on men and women. And we're going to look at that in a moment here. So the key point about compulsive heterosexuality, which means that society enforces, compels, compulsory heterosexuality as a general construct and standard on everybody in the society. So the key point about it being compulsive is that sexuality is, you can see from this, right, more than just an individual behavior. It's also an institution. So, and as an institution, like all institutions, it has the power to dictate norms. The norms, the rules that we live by, have the same root as the word normal. So heteronormativity, heterosexuality, compulsive heterosexuality actually has the power to dictate the norms, uh, i.e., to be masculine is to be heterosexual and to distribute power and privilege. That's what men do. But compulsive heterosexuality for women is more about men maintaining power over women. And for men, it's more about maintaining access to power as men. The access to power is the foundational point for male heterosexuality from this perspective. Always remember, we're talking here about various theories about these things, okay? So an example of that is being suspected or viewed as gay is dangerous for men because it's not just about a boy's sexual identity or desire. It's about his masculinity, okay, his identity. So let's look at a brief history of heterosexuality. This is surprising, really. Early sociologists took their study of sexuality from a social perspective which focused exclusively on heterosexuality. That was just the default understanding of sexuality, was heterosexuality. Okay? And so it focused on two main things, main tasks: documenting the practices of heterosexuals and establishing what were the boundaries of normal, quote, normal and quote, abnormal sexuality. But to take a step back, I like the title of this next section, which is The Invention of Heterosexuality. Because surprisingly, there was no such thing as heterosexuality before the 19th century, nor was there anything called homosexuality. And that's because of the important distinctions that historians make between the words heterosexual and homosexual, and what they have come to represent as compared with the actual behaviors of people. So that's not to say that there were no behaviors that we today would call heterosexual or homosexual. There weren't those specific words 100 plus years ago, because people have always engaged in, female, male, standard, heterosexual gender behavior. But it wasn't until about 1886 that kind of normal, standard male, female sexual behavior was labeled or called heterosexuality. That word was coined, okay? So, or calling people heterosexual, that was all coined about 1886. And at the same time, same gender sexual behavior has been common for many periods and cultures. We go back to the ancient Greeks again and other cultures. But it wasn't until about 120 years ago that it was labeled as homosexual, that word was changed. Hetero, different, two different sex with, two genders. Homo, sex with the same gender. The two terms, and homo means the same. I forgot to tell you this earlier. the homogenized milk. Okay, the homo of the homogenized is the milk and cream are all mixed up together, whole milk. It's not separated. Skim milk is separated. Okay. The two terms entered the English language at about the same time because they don't make sense with each other. If you're going to coin the term heterosexual, you have to coin another term that is something different, right? Homosexual. So they were made popular by one of the very first sexologists. He's very famous, Richard Kraft Ebing. And he wrote about homosexuality, of course, as a personality disorder. He was a psychologist, not a sociologist. And he wrote about this as some homosexuality as a personality disorder in his book, Psychopathia Sexualis, published in 1886. There we go. That's when it was coined, right? And Psychopathia Sexualis is Latin for psychopathic sexuality. That's how he viewed homosexuality. So, once again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Language is important. If you parse words and you take them apart, you get a much deeper understanding of what their real meaning is and what they derived from, the ideas they derived from. So, you can see language is important. All forms of what were considered, quote, pathological sexual behaviors. This is very interesting. All of those forms are mostly non-procreative and do not lead to the birth of a child, right? And that became one of the most powerful distinctions, important distinctions between what was normal and abnormal. Does this form of sexuality lead to pregnancy? If not, it's abnormal. This is the early, way this was all developed, just so you know. Now, the next section is asking one sex or two. What does this tell us about the sex category and gender system, as well as the distribution of power in these historical societies? Well, many historians of gender point out that the fact that the categories of sexuality weren't based on sex category or on gender, and it shows a different view of them during these times. Because as we talked about in chapter 1, in most of Anglo-European society, the predominant view of women and men was a one-gender model. Remember that discussion from chapter 1? A one-gender model, rather than our current two-gender model. We'll go over this briefly again for you. So that model, one-gender model, was inherited from the ancient Greeks, and it viewed women as not a completely different or separate type from men, but has inferior versions of men. What that means is they're not fundamentally different, but inferior to them, just as the men are inferior to God. So everybody was made in the model of gods, according to the Greek idea here. Men were the next closest to gods, and women were below that. Okay? But so there was one gender. In the current two-gender model, women and men are perceived, as we know, as two completely different types of people. Sex categories are discrete, i.e., you're either male or female, and there's nothing in between or different. But the one-gender model helps us to understand how distinctions based on sexual behavior were made in history, as well, this is important, as how power was distributed. Because in a one-gender model, women are still at the bottom of the hierarchy, of course. The hierarchy is a different model than it currently is. So they had less power than men in the one-gender model, quite a bit less, but they were still considered the same gender, and the power, access to power, different areas, different spheres of power were different. I had to use that word again during the Greek times. Okay, so because of this, historically the categories of sexuality focused almost entirely on the behavior of men. Women's sexual behavior, if it was with other women, was considered to be mostly unimportant. Who cared, right? Right. It was the men who were important. So that's what everybody was paying attention to, defining, describing, etc. So the most important aspect in this one gender model of sexuality isn't the sex category of the person you were sexually involved with, but where that person was in the hierarchy and whether or not you were the dominant person in the relationship. Okay. So remember, in ancient Greece, what we call homosexuality was kind of glorified because men were superior to women, although the same gender. So you couldn't really have an intellectual relationship with a woman in the way the Greeks thought about this. And so there was plenty of homosexuality, but it wasn't important. That didn't matter. What mattered was, were you the dominant person in the relationship? Did you have the power or not? So let's look at sexuality in a cross-cultural perspective. So we've established now the idea of heterosexuality and homosexuality is a fairly recent, invention in terms of terminology and divvying people up. And it was of the Anglo-European woman that came out of European Kraft Ebing and all of those folks, early psychology. And then it should follow that these concepts are unique to our world as well. And of course, researchers have been really interested in this question, and they've investigated how other cultures conceive of sexuality and categories and classifications of behaviors. So, what researchers have found, interestingly, is that cross cultural research on same sex behavior has found that social status, as related to age, for example, is often very important in dictating appropriate and inappropriate forms of behavior. Another interesting system comes from many North American Native cultures, such as the Two Spirit people, which we talked about in chapter 1, and I posted the photos there. Um, the term Two Spirit is more commonly involved men than women. All the photos I put up there in the first week were of male Two Spirits. Um, you could become a Two Spirit in different ways depending on the norms of your tribe and community. And the status of Two Spirits varied in many Native American, in different tribes, but many of the tribes believed they had exceptional abilities and qualities, such as matchmakers, love magicians, uh, medicine people. That was really an important one, medicine people, and ritual and spiritual functions. And their role was very well established and taken for granted, granted part of Native American culture. I put up a video in this week of a current modern Native American Two Spirits speaking and telling about their experience. They weren't perceived as, quote, freaks, as your book says, in quotes, or of existing outside the norms of Native American societies. They were totally integrated into Native American societies. They simply were filling one niche in their society. And there are many other similar examples, not exactly like that, of course, but examples of people who we consider anomalous sexually or in sex category in our culture that were integrated into their cultures in ways. So, how do we get through all this? Mixing it up: sex category, gender, and sexuality. So, the important thing to really learn from everything we've just talked about so far is that there's nothing given about a particular connection among sex category, gender, and sexuality that is presumed in our current society. Um, it's all mixed up, and there are three different things: gender, sex category, and sexuality. Now, in the early days, of course, many explorers and missionaries, early anthropologists as well, early social scientists, tried to make the differences and the practices that they observed and discovered in other cultures, they tried to make them fit within their own existing paradigms. But they just didn't fit. Think about two spirits again. Try and fit two spirits into you know, a 17th or 18th century European culture, or the Catholic missionary priests that came to the United States and ran into the Native Americans. It just didn't fit with their cultural ideas. So they might view them as homosexuals, even though earlier on than the 1800s, mid 1800s, they didn't have that term. Um, but that's a very ethnocentric viewpoint. It's a classic act of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is looking at somebody else's culture and seeing it and judging your own culture as better, more correct, or right relative to another culture. Okay. So now we're going to move on to measuring sexuality. So we're going to start with sexual identity. What are the rules for these socially constructed categories? Well, this is such a complicated subject. It really, really is, as I'm sure you're discovering. Modern scientific research into sexuality started at Indiana University with the famous Alfred Kinsey. And he was a biologist who published 2 volumes on human sexuality, and the first focusing on sexual behavior in the human male and the second in the human female. This was in the 1950s, okay? The research was pretty disturbing to many people because it didn't fit neatly into the category of gay or straight. Kinsey asked males and females about their activities and thoughts rather than their sexual identity, which was a completely different way of doing this kind of gender research than previously. And what he found was interesting. He found that some people had same-sex desires and encounters, but they didn't identify themselves as gay. But others with those same same-sex behaviors didn't report a homosexual identity, self-identifying as gay or lesbian, nor of having a same-sex desire. But they had the same behaviors as the people who had same-sex desires. 2 different categories, 2 different ways of thinking about their sexual identity. Okay, it was confusing, right? And Kinsey's research stirred up an awful lot of emotion and controversy. You can imagine in the 1950s what this would do to society. So we're going to move on now and look at men as sexual subjects. So the links between sex and gender are important for how men and women actually experience sexuality. Because in general, in Anglo-European culture, our culture, men are perceived as powerful sexual subjects, not objects, but subjects. What that means is that they have a sense of power and agency in their own bodies that allow them to act in their bodies, here's a key point, rather than being acted upon. Okay. As for the female identity, sexual experience, the assumption is that men have strong sexual desires. And later we're going to discuss here how women are considered sexual beings, but they're more likely to be sexualized and made into sex objects as opposed to males being sexual subjects. So the last lesson about masculinity and sexuality is that the power of sexual subjectivity and sexual desire also comes with a price. Men pay a price for those ideas of power and authority and dominance, and a very strong, almost uncontrollable sexual urge, those types of things. The price they pay is because the presumption of men's strong desires puts what are often unrealistic expectations on men, and the connection between sex and power often deprives men of genuine intimacy. Because if you're genuinely intimate, loving, caring, etc., that's not powerful, right? So some of those metaphors that are used for male sexuality create a disconnect between sexuality and other aspects of what it means to be human, and I might add what it means to be loving, such as warmth, trust, affection, respect, love, and connection. All right, now we're going to look at women as sexual objects. So if men are seen as sexual subjects, as we've just discussed, the dominant framework for women's sexuality is one of sexual objectification. And all you have to do is look at anything, music videos, advertisements, both, from any form of media to see the sexual objectification of women. The editing that is done to women's bodies and like magazine covers and things to make them their legs longer and their waists tinier and that type of thing. So women often see themselves and are seen as sexual objects, which are recipients of sexual behavior and sexual desire, the one who is acted upon and desired. And we know from research that how young women understand their first sexual experiences is as something that happened to them rather than something they initiated or wanted. And because of this kind of fraught interaction with males when you're an adolescent, what happens is, from research, they discovered that these young women often create this experience or idea of ideal love. So as you might expect, the concept of ideal love gives the adolescent boys an awful lot of control. When female teenagers were asked why it was hard to say no, even if they didn't want to engage in sex, they gave answers like, because the boys break up with you, or they say, you don't love me. In part, because of these dynamics, girls described their first sexual encounters as something that just happened to them, rather than something that they made an active decision about. And several of them used the same exact phrase, quote, it just happened. They often felt that their physical bodies were something separate from them and often outside of their own control. So let's look at cross-cultural perspectives on feminine sexuality. And this is so interesting about the Dutch culture and the American culture and young adolescent girls. And this is what I referred to earlier. So when they did this research, it turned out that the differences, very big differences about how American and Dutch girls understand themselves as sexual subjects. The differences are due to the degree to which girls learn to see themselves as sexual subjects as opposed to objects, and the messages they receive about their bodies. Dutch parents were more supportive in helping their daughters have access to information about birth control, and what it meant to be, quote, ready to have sex was based on that. It revolved around their ability to use birth control. Boy, that is really a difference, isn't it? American families were much less likely to mention birth control to their daughters, and if they did, they gave the impression that they would, quote, freak out if their daughters wanted access to it. And that's the term in the textbook, freak out. it's in quotes. In general, the sexuality of American girls, even in fairly liberal families, is either denied or seen as problematic. Very few American parents would respond the way Dutch parents do. Because for Dutch families, their daughter's sexual maturity becomes integrated into their overall relationship with their parents. There's no tension, as exists for American parents, between their daughters' needs to be seen as, quote, good girls and their sexuality. And here's a really big example of this contrast. Very striking in relation to boyfriend sleepovers or girls sleeping at boyfriends' houses. Not all Dutch parents are open to this, but the vast majority of them are. So here's how that goes. Once Dutch daughters have reached 18, parents allow boyfriends to sleep over, or vice versa, the girls to sleep at their boyfriends' homes, giving both acknowledgement and approval of their sexual relationship. And as we know, I'm sure many of you know, since you're very young at this point, in relation to me at any rate, American parents resist such a clear recognition of their daughter's sexuality. This is interesting too, the slut label. So research also shows that the quote slut label looms much larger for American girls than their Dutch counterparts. And there's really two reasons for that, okay? Uh, these beliefs that Dutch girls get from the larger culture is that in Holland, for Dutch girls, first, is that within a well-functioning culture, within a well-functioning, steady relationship, sex is permissible for girls. And second, the slut disclosure doesn't have much power in Dutch culture because both parents and children believe that teenagers can fall in love and have relationships in which sex is legitimate. So that is, I just thought that was such an interesting study. I had not really seen that one before, and I think it's fascinating. And this all, of course, brings us to what's called the double standard. The image of the slut discourse is one of the important consequences of women as sexual objects that we experience in America and other Anglo-European cultures, rather than women being seen as sexual subjects. So that's a double standard, right? Men are sexual subjects and can act upon. Women are sexual objects and are acted upon, okay? So the double standard is a cultural belief in Anglo-European society that the exact same sexual behaviors or feelings are okay for men, but not for women. And you can see how this connects back to the idea of women as sexual objects, as I just said, and men as sexual subjects. It both reflects that belief, and of course, it helps maintain it. It's the underpinnings of it by making fewer social sanctions for men than for women when they engage in sexual behavior. So let's look at sexual scripts now. Sexual scripts are the learned guidelines for sexual expression that provide individuals with a sense of appropriate sexual behavior for their particular culture. So, for example, the Anglo-European scripts like ours suggest that men should be the initiators of sexual behavior most of the time. Now, there are other cultures, of course, and you can read the section about the sexuality in Islamic cultures. It's quite interesting how that works. It's a little different than you may have assumed, because there are, of course, scripts about male activity and female passivity, but the idea of female passivity isn't quite as strong in Islam as it is in America, as it is in Anglo-European cultures, which means there has to be really strict control, right? The veiling and that type of thing. So, looking at some of these differences, the Islamic one, and there's several other examples in the chapter. When you look at the cultural and historic perspective of sexual scripts, it's apparent that modern Anglo-European idea that women are passive is somewhat an anomaly. Looking historically at other cultures, both in parts of Greek mythology and Hindu mythology, also women were much more subject sexually than an object, that type of thing. So why are our current ideas so different from the sexual scripts of many other cultures, which give women some more power about being a subject rather than an object? Some feminists suggest that the idea of passive feminine sexuality is an attempt to control women's power in society. In a study of adolescent girls, it showed that puberty and the first sexual experiences explain the drop in self-esteem that many young girls have around this age. Because being a sexual object, as if one's body is beyond one's control, affects how girls think about themselves in general, not just sexually. Okay, you are in a less powerful one down position as an object. Okay, so controlling a person's sexuality is also a means to control our own sense of agency and efficiency, what we can do, right? What we're capable of. How much power do we have? How much access do we have to what we need in the world to thrive, and etc. Sexual scripts also provide strong support for the role of social life in influencing our sexuality. Because, as with gender itself, the ways we think about the sexuality of women and men are dependent on the cultural context in which we live and how those definitions are created and categories are created. It's interesting here. There's just this brief section. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but about stabane and sexuality in South Africa. Stabane is a Zulu vernacular word to describe intersex individuals, and South Africa's constitution was the very first in the world to provide protection to its citizens on the basis of sexual orientation, gender, and sex category. So South Africa is, was far ahead of all the other countries to be the first to legislate that protection. So what happens when people violate sexual scripts? I'll go into this with the Texas, but one of them is uppity women, that derogatory term applied to Black women a lot. And we've seen that recently in much of what's going on in the news with judges and a variety of other Black women judges and lawyers, etc., prosecutors. So that's one example of why women aren't supposed to be uppity, right? Because we're objects, okay? So that's what happens when women violate sexual scripts. Well, as already discussed, sexual behavior is much more complicated than just the terms heterosexual and homosexual imply. Because sexual identity is who we feel we are in regard to our sexuality. And, there's a set of behaviors and ideas and scripts in modern day Euro-American society. The identities that we're referring to are usually connected to sexual cultures as a particular way of life characterized by a group of people who share a sexual identity. Your text refers to the film Paris is Burning as an example, and if you ever have a chance to see that film, it is an amazing film and a great example of this. So another example of different, quote, they were gay people in Paris. Another aspect of different, quote, scripts that is especially prevalent among women is the concept and the use of what's called front stage behavior and backstage behavior. I'm in my front stage behavior now, okay? And I was when I taught class in person. That's front stage behavior. Going to your job is front stage behavior. It's a presentation of self. It's not schlepping around in your jammies at home, eating a quart of ice cream or something. That's backstage behavior. And women we all have front stage behavior and backstage behavior. You have to if you want to keep a job or be, do anything in the way out there in the world, professional. That's true for all of us. But women are particularly careful through research it shows of this, our front stage behavior, how we present ourselves to the world. So we're going to look now at bisexuality and what's called the bisexual umbrella. So what happens if we're outside the sphere of heteronormativity, of, two gender normality? How do sexual scripts then change? Well, bisexuality is an example of that with its own stigmas attached to it, because bisexuals often receive negative attention from both heterosexuals and homosexuals. They don't fit into either category. So negativity is often directed at them from both camps, actually. Asexuality, of course, is a person. A means absence of or against. Asexual, abnormal, think about that, against normal, not normal. Asexuality is a person who does not experience sexual attraction at all. And those who claim an asexual identity stress that not experiencing sexual attraction is not a disorder. So they say, similar to people in other, in lesbian community, gay community, they say they've always been asexual. This is interesting, even before they had a label to describe it. Okay. Now we're going to look at sexuality and power, because once again, sociologists look at inequalities of power and who has the power and who doesn't. So this is sexuality and power, heteroprivilege in schools. Now we know that sexuality intersects with gender through sexual scripts, which we just talked about, and sexual identity. Okay, so therefore it's not surprising that sexuality is a tool used to distribute power in our social lives. And the heterosexual questionnaire, again, is a perfect example of that, because it revealed some of the privileges associated with sexual identity. Nobody ever asks you those questions if you're heterosexual, but they're questions that are asked of people who are homosexual often, particularly in the, psychologist's office or the minister's office. For example, if you're straight, you never had to explain your identity or explain why you're straight, okay? And not having to do so, this is a key point, not having to do so is a privilege. Not having to explain yourself is a privilege, and that is called heteroprivilege. It's a set of rights just automatically given to heterosexuals. And, that is the example. You never have to or rarely explain your sexuality to other people. And in institutions, norms and values also reinforce this heteronormativity, the normality of heterosexuality. Think about this. Prior to the Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court case in 2015, which legalized gay and lesbian marriage in all states, the only kind of marriage was heteronormative marriage. So in heteronormative societies, all institutions privilege heterosexuals, Researchers have actually demonstrated the ways in which middle schools, for example, as educational institutions, control sexuality and enforce heterosexuality through curriculum and norms. So this is called a hegemonic curriculum. And it both remember we talked about hegemonic masculinity previously in a previous chapter. Hegemonic curriculum both legitimizes the dominant culture and marginalizes or rejects other cultures and forms of knowledge. Now, that's not true in college, thank heavens. This is where you get to learn about other cultures and other ideas. So, and anthropology and sociology are two disciplines that really, really take you there and help you learn about other ways of thinking and being. The schools, the middle schools and high schools, also provide informal situations like the prom, for example, which represents the culmination, right? All of us who've been to a prom recognize this. It represents the culmination of the hetero-romantic norm that dominates middle schools and high schools. Because hetero-romantic norms prescribe, they dictate specific behaviors for men and women that are really important to proving masculinity or femininity and to gaining acceptance in our culture when you get out of school. So often heterosexuality is actually, quote, enforced in schools by the ongoing harassment of gay and lesbian students, unfortunately. In one study, 84% of LGBTQ students had been verbally harassed, while 82.9% added that teachers and administrators rarely, if ever, intervened when they overheard homophobic comments. So that's one institution of education. Now let's look at nationalism and heteronormativity. So, in a globalizing world, the Anglo European categories of heterosexuality and homosexuality are increasingly becoming the dominant way of thinking about sexuality. In the global South, for example, many people associate homosexuality with the West and with Western imperialism. Now, we're going to look at nationalism here. This is a very interesting section or idea about how nationalism and ideas of heteronormativity are connected. So, nationalism is a way of promoting and legitimizing peoplehood identity and sovereignty. And nationalism is usually both gendered and sexualized, surprisingly. It is inherently masculine. Its scripts of nationalism are primarily written for men, by men, about men. It also emphasizes and resonates with masculine themes such as honor, patriotism, cowardice, bravery, and duty. Women's role in nationalism, as you might imagine, is largely reproductive and symbolic because women's bodies can come to represent a nation, and therefore the purity of women's bodies is important to nationalist causes. And this partly explains the use of rape as a very powerful weapon of war and or ethnic conflict. And women's role is reproductive. It's to increase the population of the nation. And I put up a reading for you about what's happening with that in Hungary right now and Poland. So with nationalism, homosexuality is extremely problematic because, first of all, nationalism is a very backward-looking vision, and it advocates return to some real or more often imaginary past before the true culture was polluted. Um, Homosexuality also threatens the masculinity of nationalist movements, leading to homosexual panics, as in the Nazi persecutions during World War II, where homosexuals were made to wear a pink triangle and sent to concentration camps. I don't know if you know about that, but that happened. And during the Cold War, the US Senator Joseph McCarthy, famous for his search for communists, also searched for and investigated homosexuals in the government. So all of this demonstrates the way in which sexuality and gender, like gender, can be an important tool of power. Okay, I will see you next week.